And I will stop sharing so that Dr. Walker can share her slides.
Okay, Joanna, it looks like you'll need to give me permission to share my slides. That's okay. Hello, everyone. It's so good to be here and good to see you all on a late Thursday afternoon for you all at 7:30 here on the East Coast. But I'm really glad to be here. I did want to mention briefly, and maybe this can be deleted from the recording itself. We were talking about how we're under a tornado watch right now here in Charlotte. So if it moves into a tornado warning, we might have to stop the presentation so that I can seek shelter. But hopefully that does not happen. But I just wanted to throw it out there that we will come up with a contingency plan in the event that that does happen, but crossing my fingers that it does not. Well, welcome. As Joanna mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about students with extensive support needs and how we can think about involving them in universal or tier 1 positive behavioral interventions and supports. So I'm Virginia Walker, and I really am excited about this topic because a lot of my work focuses on inclusive education for this particular student population. And when we think about inclusive education, we think about placement in general education classrooms and other inclusive settings. But I have recently been thinking a lot about inclusion in school-wide systems, in particular, school-wide positive behavioral interventions and supports. So this is another, from my perspective, another really important aspect of inclusive education, particularly for the student population. So we have a fairly small group today. So if you could, please feel free to let me know who you are by entering perhaps your role in the chat. And because we're such a small group, feel free to let me know why you're interested in this particular topic. So let's see who's in the room. So we've got behavior specialists. Valerie's already asking some really amazing questions. Hold on to that question, Valerie. Okay, we've got several BCBAs. All right, keep those coming. BCBA, some coaches. We've got an advocate. Wonderful, wonderful. And an element. Okay, we've got an administrator in the group. Great. All right, well, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. That's very helpful. And, as we go through today's session, please feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, type a question in the chat. I am happy to be interrupted because I would really love for this to be more of a discussion so that we can, share our own experiences as we're thinking through some of this content. And I see an aspiring BCBA currently completing your supervision hours. You're so close. Wonderful. Okay, so here's what I'm hoping we can accomplish today. One, I'd like to talk a little bit about PBIS and what it is, what it isn't, and how students with extensive support needs fit into PBIS. Then I would love to spend some time thinking about some of the barriers that perhaps you all face or that have been documented in the literature and what we can do to overcome some of those barriers, thinking about particular supports we can put in place to make sure that PBIS is being implemented in an inclusive and equitable way across all students in a school. And then if we have time, there are some other considerations that I think would be important to discuss or at least consider in this conversation. So I have all of the resources that I'm going to share within this document. So if you want to go ahead and enter that tiny URL into your search bar, or if you would like to just take a screenshot of that to save for later, please go ahead and do that now so that you have access to it. So I'll just give you a few moments to capture that in whatever way makes sense for you. Okay. So let's move on to talk about PBIS. That's why we're here, right? So I think the very first thing that we need to do is think about this particular student population so that we're all on the same page in terms of who it is we're talking about. So when I think about students who are considered to have extensive support needs, this is the population of students who have a wide range of support needs, a wide range of characteristics. And usually these are the students who are receiving special education services under these particular categories: intellectual disability, autism, and multiple disabilities. However, it's important to note that not all students with intellectual disability and not all students with autism would be considered to have extensive support needs. We also know that these students are likely to participate in the state alternate assessment, and those are the assessments that are based on alternate academic achievement standards. So that's one way we can identify students who have extensive support needs. And importantly, and I think this is incredibly relevant to the work that you all are doing and to the topic of this session, is that this particular student population, these students from this population are at an increased risk of being subjected to restraint and seclusion. And there are a number of reasons why that might be the case. One of those reasons is that students with extensive support needs often also have complex communication needs. So they require a lot of support to communicate. So that could potentially be one reason why we see those increased risk levels for restraint and seclusion. What we also know is that this population of students is less likely to spend a majority of their day in inclusive general education settings within the school. So I'll just show you some of the recent federal data that we have from the annual report to Congress that was released in 2023. And this, of course, is from the United States Department of Education. So these data are from 2020. And as you can see, I've pulled the data for those three categories that include students with extensive support needs, so intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, and autism. In the far left column, that bar represents the percentage of students, all students receiving special education services in the United States who spend most of their day in the general education classroom. So you can see that for students with intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, and autism, their percentages are much lower compared to the percentage of all students with disabilities receiving those special education services. So it's really clear here, and these data are consistent across time, that this population of students is less likely to receive services in these inclusive environments. And the reason why I bring this up is because we're starting to see a connection between placement in inclusive settings and students' involvement in positive behavioral interventions and supports as a framework. And we'll kind of get into that literature a little bit later in the presentation. I mentioned this earlier, but these students typically are considered to have pervasive, ongoing support needs across a range of different domains. So those domains could relate to academics. It could relate to different life skills. You might have heard people refer to functional skills, communication, etc. And what's really important to note is that because this population exhibits very different characteristics and support needs, the type of support that they require to be successful, the frequency of that support, and the amount of time each day support will be needed is going to vary from student to student. And that's really important when we're thinking about ensuring that Tier 1 or universal PBIS is accessible and meaningful for this population. So I always like to, when we're thinking about developing supports for students, I like to go back to the social ecological model of disability as a reminder that disability from this perspective is evident when there's a gap or a mismatch between what someone is able to do or their knowledge and then what's expected of them within the environment, or in other words, environmental demands. And I think it's important to think about it this way, because when we can identify that mismatch or that gap between what someone can do and what's expected of them, we can then start to think about the supports that we need to provide. And so this is just a visual representing that conceptualization of disability. And this would apply to really anyone with a disability. So you can see there that you've got personal competence on the top, environmental demands on the bottom, and then when those don't align, there is a mismatch, and that is when disability is evident. So we can build supports that improve someone's competence, and we can also build supports that change the environment to address those environmental demands. And this is, kind of what we do on a daily basis, right? So again, just another visual representation here about that social ecological model and how we can really think about supports that change the environment, supports that that improve someone's competency. And then of course, there are supports that do both, right? So there's that overlap you see here. So when we're thinking about PBIS, we need to think about how we're building supports for students with extensive support needs to address that mismatch. So in this case, we're thinking about behavioral expectations, what is expected of students based on those defined behavioral expectations in a school, and looking at what they're currently able to do and their current knowledge, and making sure that we're building those supports that allow them to be successful within the context of PBIS. I also want to bring this up. This is a common misconception, so I think it's a good idea to talk about it early in this session. A lot of times I will hear that students with extensive support needs are Tier 3 students. And that, yeah, I see a head shaking. So that is absolutely not the case. There are many students with extensive support needs who require Tier 1 supports only when it comes to their behavioral support needs. Not all students with extensive support needs will need those Tier 3 behavioral supports. So that's really important, because oftentimes that explanation is used as a way to justify excluding students from other aspects of PBIS. So here's just an illustrative example. So let's just say we have our student here, Olivia, and Olivia is extremely talented academically. She's reading on grade level. Okay. So she's able to access a poster like this. Let's assume this poster is posted in all the bathrooms in a school, right? And it clearly outlines what's expected of students. Allowing for privacy, flushing the toilet, using the toilet quickly and quietly, keeping the bathrooms clean, washing your hands, right? All of these expected behaviors are posted in the bathroom. And Olivia is able to read this poster. She's doing quite well in the courses in the general education classroom. But she does require some support when it comes to some daily living skills and personal hygiene skills. And so let's just say that Olivia is unable to independently wash her hands. Okay, so that is her competence in that area is not meeting the environmental demands, right? So there's a mismatch, there's a gap there. And so if we're thinking about it from that perspective, where we look at someone's abilities and then we look at the demands and we build supports to bridge that gap, in this case, we would then say, let's build some supports, right? I mean, what are some things that come to mind that we could do to support Olivia in meeting these bathroom expectations? And so if she's not able to wash her hands, we think about all the tools that we have. Could we, feel free to add some ideas in the chat, but, could we task analyze the skill? Could we use visual supports? Could we use some sort of prompting system? So we have all of these good practices that we could use. What we wouldn't do, but what happens is, we would never say, well, let's just not include her in tier 1 because she's not engaging in the expected behavior. She must need tier 2 or tier 3 support, right? We wouldn't do that, but that happens all the time. So this presentation is really centered around thinking about how we address that gap or that mismatch at tier 1, and not assuming that students with extensive support needs wouldn't benefit from those supports. Okay, so I have a poll everywhere. I'm going to pull it up quickly, but I just want you to think about some misconceptions that, are you all able to see my screen still? Yeah, perfect. Some misconceptions about students with extensive support needs. And it could be in general, or it could just be related to PBIS. So you can scan the QR code, or you can use that URL, or you can enter your responses via a text message. But I'm just curious to know, what kind of misconceptions might others hold about students with ESN? And it's a really important thing to think about when we're thinking through how we address barriers in relation to PBIS. And if you feel more comfortable entering it into the chat, that's fine too. Okay, level of behavior. In that, I'm assuming that is regarding misconceptions about students with extensive support needs having more significant behavioral needs. Anyone else have any thoughts? Let's see. Okay, yeah, individual capabilities within the classroom. That is certainly one that I have experienced. Lack of ability. Yeah, capabilities, ability. Yeah, in just a moment, I will share with you some of the research on this. And you probably won't be too surprised by what you see. Low expectations. Yeah, exactly. So keep those coming. We have a lot to cover, but I appreciate your participation. So we'll cover some of those in just a moment, but let's dive into PBIS first. So this was a definition that was updated in 2016 by Don Kincaid and some of his colleagues. And so I think it's always useful to refer to some of the published definitions. So they say that PBIS is an approach to behavior support. Some of those important features is that we're using research-based assessment and intervention. We're using database decision-making, which focuses on improving competencies, creating those supportive contexts, and prevention of challenging behavior. So those are all really important aspects of PBIS. We also know that, according to this definition, we're focusing on strategies that are respectful and respectful of a person's dignity and their well-being. And I think that is especially important for students with extensive support needs who are often at increased risk for potentially harmful practices and practices that certainly would not be considered respectful. And so I just have a list here of things to consider when we're determining whether or not the strategies we're using are respectful, particularly for this population. One of which is that the strategies we use, there should be some evidence that they're effective, right? So we want to prioritize and think through practices that are based in research. The second one here that I have is our strategy should only be as special as necessary. We don't want to over support students. Certainly we don't want to under support them, but we don't want to over support them and draw unnecessary negative attention, right? We want to make sure we're promoting inclusive experiences through our practices while also ensuring that students are building independence. And then finally, dignity of risk. And this is something that is especially relevant for students with extensive support needs. We want to make sure that we're thinking about building student self-determination and giving opportunities to take reasonable risks. And that's really important. And I have a link here. If you all have never seen this piece, I suppose it's a poem, but this is a very, I would say, a seminal piece in this discussion of dignity of risk. So you can just Google this. I'm not going to read it for you, but it's a pretty powerful piece that focuses on this concept of dignity of risk. But I just wanted you all to have that and know it's out there. Moving on to the next component of this definition, and this is, the focus of this presentation is that, PBIS can be applied to an individual student, but we're talking about this multi-tiered framework, right? And specifically for us in schools, where students are receiving support across a continuum, and all students in a school participate in PBIS, specifically at Tier 1. And just so you're aware, and you probably are, but in case you're not, here's the Center on PBIS website, so pbis.org, a lot of really great resources here about the different tiers, about different sort of assessments, and different resources. So as I mentioned, when we're thinking about PBIS as a framework and when it's applied as a framework, we're thinking about this continuum of interventions and supports that increase in intensity. One thing I'd like to mention that's another misconception is that if a student needs a more intensive intervention or support at a higher level tier, they should still receive support at the lower level tier or tiers. So it's adding on to what is already there. So if a student with extensive support needs tier 2 support, they should also be receiving tier 1 at the same time. Okay, I'm curious let's see, let me see if I can see you all. How many of you all are working in a PBIS school? So I see one hand. You can use your virtual hand. Okay. So this is great that we'll go over some of these features then. So tier 1 or universal PBIS is in this picture. This visual is at the bottom of this triangle, or it's the foundation. I think of it as the foundation of this framework. And this should be accessible to all students. So each and every student in a school. And this is where we're really focusing on teaching students those expected behaviors and publicly acknowledging them when they engage in those expected behaviors. So if you think back to our example with Olivia, and there was that poster in the bathroom with all of the expectations, that would be at the tier 1 level, right? So the expectation is all students in a school would understand, in that case, how to engage in those expected behaviors in the bathroom. Okay. So, you know, I'll probably say this about 10 more times, but this is meant for all students, each and every student, and all settings. It's not just for general education settings. It's not only for those inclusive school-wide settings. It's all settings, all students, and all staff. So it truly is a school-wide effort. And as I mentioned, at this tier, we're thinking about teaching expected behavior, right? Those school-wide expectations, providing students with opportunities to build those social, emotional, and behavioral skills, establishing practices within classrooms that are aligned to those school-wide expectations. And as I mentioned, ensuring that we're acknowledging expected behavior. And lastly, developing some sort of procedures to use when challenging behavior occurs at this level. So a lot of times what you'll see is a school will identify 3 to 5 positively stated school-wide expectations. So things like be safe, be respectful, be responsible, and those become the school-wide expectations. Then what happens is the school will define what each of those looks like across all school settings. So what does it look like in the bathroom, the cafeteria, the hallway, individual classrooms, the dismissal area, the playground, etc. So this is just an example of a matrix that Obama Elementary School has created for their Tiger expectations. So you can see that their school-wide expectations are to be respectful, responsible, and safe. And they've specified what that looks like across all of their school settings, the hallway, the lunch, during playtime at an assembly, etc. So that's pretty standard practice. And you will see posters in some schools in those settings. As we saw earlier with Olivia's example, this could potentially be posted in the bathroom for students as a reminder. And then, as I mentioned, there's also different acknowledgement systems. So in this case, perhaps the school delivers tiger paws whenever students engage in expected behaviors, and the students collect those tiger paws, and at some point they have an opportunity to exchange those tiger paws for some sort of reward of some sort, whether that's something from a prize bin, or maybe it's a class party or some sort of event that is, I'm going to say, potentially reinforcing. So we're not going to focus on tier 2 or tier 3 in this particular presentation, but I think it's important to understand what those entail. So tier 2 is for some students who need additional support in addition to tier 1. And so oftentimes that involves increased instruction and practice developing those social, emotional, behavioral skills. It could involve increased adult supervision, increased positive reinforcement, pre-corrections, or an increased focus on behavioral function. So at tier 2, you can start engaging in function-based thinking and trying to understand the function of behavior. And it also might mean that they need increased access to academic supports. And so here are just some examples of particular interventions that you might have encountered in a school implementing PBIS at tier 2, check and connect, maybe some sort of social skills group, first steps to success. And I think check and check out is probably one of the most common tier 2 supports, where students are checking in throughout the day with someone who is filling out a progress report based on how they're engaging in those expected behaviors, and they're working towards a daily goal. So I see that a lot in schools at tier 2. And then for some students, and I'd say a very small percentage of students, more intensive interventions and supports will be needed. And that's when you finally get up to tier 3. And again, that would be in addition to tiers 1 and 2. And so for all the behavior analysts in the group, this is probably where you're most involved with your students who require these intensive levels of support. So again, few students. This is where we're thinking about, a functional behavior assessment and wraparound supports that might be needed in addition to behavioral support. We want to see person-centered planning happening at this level because we're developing these very individualized and tailored interventions. And we're also thinking about ensuring that those behavior plans are not only contextually relevant, but also culturally relevant. And so here's my reminder again that not all students with extensive support needs need tier 3 supports, right? That should be based on whether or not tier 1 and tier 2 were unsuccessful. So only when those 2 levels of supports are not producing the desired outcomes would you go to tier 3. Okay, so I'll just stop for one moment. And if you have any questions, please just pop them in the chat. If you have any questions about what PBIS is, what this framework's all about, I'm happy to answer those. So as you're thinking about that, I'll keep going because we only have 45 minutes left together. So this is, another misconception is that students with extensive support needs don't need to be involved in tier 1 or would not benefit from involvement in tier 1. But I just want to make it clear that this framework was built to be entirely inclusive, meaning all students, all settings, and all staff. And some of my colleagues and I, we kept running into this misconception that was being used to justify exclusion from PBIS. So we thought, let's go to the experts. Let's ask the people who are involved in developing PBIS as a framework about the intent. And not surprisingly, experts agreed that students with extensive support needs should be involved across all tiers. The only area where there was some disagreement was in the area of how to handle behavior violations. And that is a theme that keeps coming up in the research, that we know we should be including students. They should be taught the expectations. We should be acknowledging their behavior. But what do we do when they engage in challenging behavior, especially at tier 1? How do we handle that? Do we handle it in the same way as we do with other students? So that was kind of interesting for us. But what this told us is that we were correct in thinking that this is supposed to be fully inclusive, right? We can't exclude anybody from tier 1. I was also happy to see last summer that the PBIS implementation blueprint was updated, and there is now a whole section on disability, and it clearly describes the intent of PBIS to be inclusive. And I believe it even provides some recommendations on how to do that. So that was nice to see a very clear statement about the inclusive intent. So if you find yourself having to justify the inclusion of students within the framework, you've got a really nice document here that comes from the PBIS Center. So the question is not whether students should be included in this framework, it's really how. Okay, how do we make this happen? And the very first thing that we have to do is acknowledge the barriers, right? We have to understand the barriers, particularly within our own work settings, but also looking at barriers that have been documented in the literature. And then we can start to think about solutions to address those barriers. So I wanted to first start by talking a little bit about what we know in relation to student involvement in PBIS. And you probably won't be surprised by our findings. This first one was by a research team out of Vanderbilt, Brooke Schuster and her colleagues. And they surveyed a pretty nice group of special education teachers, 849. And what they found is that there were significant differences in how people were involved, how students were involved, and the perceptions of teachers based on the population they taught. So in all cases here, when the respondents were teachers of students with extensive support needs, their perceptions of the benefit of involvement for their students decreased or was significantly lower than special education teachers who worked with students who had high incidence disabilities. Their own participation, the teacher's participation, was significantly lower, and their perceptions about whether their students should be included was significantly lower when they were teachers of students with extensive support needs. So we did a little bit of work that was similar. We looked at 179 school personnel from schools that were implementing PBIS. And what we found is that student participation and perceptions of the importance or the value of including students varied across respondents. So all in all, it really just depended on the school in terms of whether or not students were involved in various aspects of PBIS. But what we did find is that there were some significant differences based on grade level, how many tiers that school was implementing, and the extent of inclusion in that school. So elementary schools tended to have higher levels of involvement in terms of students with extensive support needs. When schools were implementing all 3 tiers of PBIS, they tended to have higher levels of student involvement. And then when they were more inclusive in general, right, they had more students with extensive support needs spending most of their day in general education classrooms, participation in PBIS was significantly higher. And then finally, Jenny Kurth and Allison Zagona also looked into this and surveyed PBIS coaches at different schools. And they found again that educational placement seemed to be related to the teachers' ratings or the PBIS coaches' ratings. So importance of involvement was significantly lower when teachers supported students with ESN in segregated settings. So what does this all mean? It really means that there seems to be something going on with placement. So if students with extensive support needs are primarily placed in segregated, self-contained classes, they're not as involved in PBIS. So we won't go to this URL, but it could be, if you wanted to access that link, it could be a nice tool for an educational team, including a BCBA, to use to think about barriers to inclusion in PBIS for this particular student population. But, just think about what are some of the barriers that might exist. And I think you've already identified a few that were related to the misconceptions that you posted earlier, that people might view students with extensive support needs as perhaps not being capable or having the ability to participate in Tier 1. People having those low expectations was another one that I saw you list. And so a lot of those barriers have been reported in the literature, and I just wanted to share that with you too. So from that Schuster study, they found exactly that teachers perceived students as having difficulty understanding school-wide expectations. They don't need to participate in that school-wide acknowledgement system because they have their own reinforcement system. It's a barrier because the school-wide lesson plans aren't modified for that particular population. General education teachers may not support students with extensive support needs, and then the rewards may not be meaningful. And I think those are, for the most part, those are legitimate concerns. But again, think back to what we talked about earlier when we build supports to address that gap, right? Yeah, I agree. This certainly applies to people beyond school-wide settings. And if you go to the PBIS website, there's a lot of great information about PBIS applied within the home setting, within community settings, beyond school. Yeah, great point. And then finally, scheduling conflicts, right? So students with extensive support needs not having the same schedule as the rest of their peers. And so it makes it difficult for them to participate in those acknowledgement programs. In our study, we had some interesting findings when we asked about barriers, but I think the most interesting is at the very bottom there, that just under 40% of the folks who participated indicated that student characteristics would make it challenging for them to participate in Tier 1. And that to us, perhaps isn't surprising, but it's alarming. Because we know we have the tools, we know how to support students. We know what works, and we just have to build those supports to address that mismatch between those expectations at Tier 1 and what students are able to do and their current knowledge. This was one recently too, and I don't mean to bore you with the research, but I think it's just really important to understand that these barriers are relatively consistent across the board, that people are thinking about this in a very similar way, having very similar experiences. So again, we interviewed some teams from different schools implementing PBIS, and some of these same barriers came up. Low expectations of students, student characteristics, misconceptions, receiving services primarily in exclusive environments. So we have a good idea about why student involvement is limited. And we also know that it shouldn't be limited. We know that they should be fully included within this framework. So we've got to think about supports that we can put into place to ensure that PBIS is being implemented in an inclusive and equitable way. Okay. So let me just take a look at the time. So we've got about 30 minutes remaining. So I'm going to give you all an opportunity to, I might try to get you in groups if I can figure out the technology, because we do have a small group. So we could probably get into groups of 2 or 3. But let's just assume we have, this student, and he's coming to this new elementary school. They're implementing PBIS. They've established their school-wide expectations. They've defined what they look like. And this is a student who is an emerging reader. Okay, so not yet able to read on grade level. This student has a communication device. Let's just say he's using Colloquia to go on an iPad. So that's like a speech generating device. So that's how he communicates. That's his primary mode of communication. And let's also assume that he has extensive support needs across multiple areas, including academics, including different sort of life skills. So I want you to kind of think about this student, and I'm certainly not giving you enough information to fully understand the scope of this particular student's support needs. But let's just think about this student with the information I provided. And let's assume we're at Obama Elementary School, and we've got be respectful, be responsible, be safe. Those are those school-wide expectations, and they're clearly defined. And let's say we're thinking about how we are going to support this student I believe this lesson plan is for the bathroom. So how are we going to make sure that this student is fully supported so that he can be successful in meeting those school-wide expectations in the bathroom? Okay, so what strategies might you use? What barriers might there be that the team would need to think about so that Amari could participate in a meaningful way in Tier 1? So that link goes to a lesson plan that the school would be expected to follow in terms of supporting students to learn about the bathroom expectations at their school. So go ahead and access that while I get you into, I think I can get you into breakout rooms. Yes, I can. So we'll take maybe, like five minutes for you all to read through the lesson plan that the school has established for the bathroom. and to think about, come up with some ideas, like what might be a barrier and what strategies could you use to support this particular student. So as I'm doing that, and room 2. Okay, so I have you assigned to 2 different breakout rooms. Once you're there, go ahead and unmute and start sharing some of your ideas, and then we'll come back together in about 5 minutes, okay? All right, here we go. So if you're still in this main room, look for a notification that pops up asking you to join either room 1 or room 2.
And I did have one request. I tried to put the URL in the chat because they couldn't access it.
Oh, they couldn't
I think
get
I
it.
did it correctly. I just copied it. I mean, I just typed it.
Let's see. I hope they can get it. Let's see. Okay, so
But this is a test for those who have their cameras off. You need to go to a breakout room. So we hope you're paying attention. If you can't access the rooms, you need to message us in the chat or turn on your video and let us know. Why not?
let's see. Let's-
I'm sorry, but can you send me a message one more time, please? I excellent. Okay, here we go. Thanks.
Did you get it? Okay, good. Okay, I'm gonna keep an eye on the time. And then hopefully they had.
So, April, are you able to join a breakout room? Or Ulrich? I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Especially for the CEUs, we need to see you on video and see you actively engaged in participating.
Hmm. Share the URL. Broadcast this.
Okay, sorry. I think everybody else is in the breakout room, right?
Yeah, it looks like we lost 2 people. I think maybe 2 people logged out. 7. All right, they're coming back in. All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope that you had some great discussions. If I could have one of the groups, a representative from one of the groups, unmute and share with us a potential barrier that you identified. What might have been a potential barrier for Amari being successful in meeting those expectations in the bathroom?
Hi, Virginia. Javier
Hi.
here. I was going to ask that question, who's going to represent the group? So I hope my colleagues or the other participants, they don't blame me. And I was just going to try what I was just trying to throw in that group. I was describing a situation where the girl has anxiety or a very or a more than average anxious condition.
Yeah.
So what to do in that case? And that was my next question, and that was what I was suggesting to work on. But because a plan is as good as the plan it is, it's a good plan, but the kind of things that can happen, the kind of oops, include those situations. So that was
Yeah.
going to be my take on the plan.
Yeah. So what if the student experiences some anxiety? Yeah, that could potentially be a barrier. And when you're looking at their existing lesson plan, are there opportunities to enhance that lesson plan or add to it in a way that would promote Amari's particular support, address Amari's particular support needs? Yeah, I think, there might be some potential barriers related to his physical needs, perhaps, or using his communication device to express his understanding of those expected behaviors. So I think there are a lot of different ways that we could think about supporting Amari. And of course, it would always be helpful to have more information about the student. So good. I hope you all were able to kind of think through some what if scenarios about this particular student. So I just wanted to share some of the work that's been done in this area so you can continue thinking about ways in which you can support students. Sadly, there have only been 2 studies addressing this. So we don't have a lot of research support, but in this particular area, but what we do have is a lot of research evidence about what works for the student population in general. But we do know it can work. This one study came from a school that was implementing tiers 2 and 3 only. They were not implementing tier 1, but when they added tier 1, they saw positive outcomes for the student population. Not surprising. In a study that we conducted, we looked at using universal design for learning and evidence-based practices for the student population to enhance what was already taking place at tier 1. And as you can see here, these are probably familiar graphs to each and every one of you in here, if you're a behavior analyst especially. You could see that in their baseline, they were engaging in a high level of challenging behavior. And again, this is
Virginia, do you want to share your screen? Excuse me.
Oh my gosh, thank you. Yes. I apologize. Let me get back on.
Sorry, Virginia, I just saw the note in the chat and realized that as well.
That's okay. Yeah, that would be helpful to see the graphs. So these were the graphs I was referring to that you couldn't see. Thank you for letting us know. So as I was mentioning, during baseline, when these students were not accessing tier 1, they had high levels of challenging behavior. But when those tier 1 supports were adapted using universal design for learning and those evidence-based practices, we saw a reduction in challenging behavior for all 3 of our student participants. So we do have some evidence that that these sort of practices can be effective for students with extensive support needs. So I wanted to share a little bit more about that work that we've done and some of our other recommendations. So again, thinking about how we build supports that are going to address that mismatch, in this case, as it relates to PBIS. I would strongly encourage you to access some of these resources that are available to you freely. These resources are available through the TIES Center, which was a technical assistance center focused on inclusion for students with the most extensive needs. And in some of these cases, the TIES Center partnered with the Center on PBIS to develop these resources focused on students with extensive support needs. So there's a lot of really good information in here. There are a series of short videos that are incredibly informative and could be shared with people at your school where you work. So anyway, I wanted you to be aware of those resources so that you can spend some time exploring after this session. So let's start with UDL. And I absolutely love this cartoon by Michael Giangreco. I'll give you a little overview of what I see in this cartoon. So there are some students waiting to get inside the school, and there is an adult who is shoveling snow off the stairs. And there's a student who is in a wheelchair who said, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And the adult says, "All these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you." And so the student then says, "But if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in." So clearing the path for everyone. So when we're thinking about that cartoon, we're really thinking about making sure that not only physical spaces, but the way in which that we are designing instruction is universally designed, that it's accessible to each and every student. And so when you're thinking about UDL, you're thinking about 3 different areas. One is multiple means of representation. So that's ensuring that each and every student is able to learn the information in a way that is accessible to them and effective for them. Multiple means of expression is making sure that each and every student is able to demonstrate what they know in a way that makes sense for them. So if we're thinking about Amari, he might be using his AAC device, right? His Colloquia to Go app on his iPad as a way to express what he knows, whereas other students might be able to communicate typing or vocally, right? There's different ways in which we can demonstrate what we know. Drawing a picture, right? And then finally, thinking about multiple means of engagement. So making sure that students are engaged, right? Tapping into their interest and thinking about motivation and how that differs across each and every student. You can learn more about UDL at www.cast.org. So I wanted you to have that. The other thing that we did in that study, so we thought about universal design for learning principles, but we also thought about what are evidence-based practices for this population. So a lot of those are listed here at the Cedar Center for students with extensive support needs. And then in particular for students with autism, you can go to the National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice. And they came out somewhat recently with a new updated report on evidence-based practices for individuals with autism. So we relied on thinking about it through a universal design for learning lens and relying on these already established practices that are grounded in research. So here are some things to think about as we wrap up our time together. We can use a lot of different visuals to support our students. And again, all of this has to be individualized per student, but it could be as simple as adding visual supports to a poster. Remember the bathroom poster that I shared earlier from Obama Elementary? It might be as simple as adding visual supports for students. We could use video modeling to demonstrate how we're engaging in those expected behaviors. We might need to break down complex tasks and skills into smaller chunks through task analysis. And again, these are all the tools we already have. Now we're just applying them to tier 1. We might have to use some very systematic instruction. So if you think about the lesson plan you read in relation to the Omari case study, they weren't necessarily using systematic instruction in the way we understand systematic instruction. So it could be the case that some students with extensive support needs need some very direct systematic instruction using those response prompting systems that we know work so well. Maybe a social narrative would be helpful. Here's an example of a social narrative for being safe on the playground.
Okay, no problem.
So, so all of those tools are that we know are effective.
I mean, the trip was a little much for me. Got really.
Sorry, Deanna, I just placed you on mute. I don't think you knew your microphone was on. So all of those tools we have available, we just have to think about how we can use them at tier 1, right? Likewise, oopsies, we need to think about supports for acknowledgement. So part of this is teaching the school-wide expectations. Part of it is publicly acknowledging students when they're engaging in those expectations at tier 1. So it could be that we have to think about individualizing reinforcement. Think about some of those barriers from earlier that students might not find some of those rewards to be reinforcing. So we might have to introduce some individualized reinforcement that we can pair with existing acknowledgement systems. And so I just have a link here that takes you to some information about how to conduct preference assessments and reinforcer assessments to really try to understand how we could individualize reinforcement so that we can pair it with those acknowledgement systems. We might have to provide reinforcement more frequently. So oftentimes students are receiving some sort of token every now and then, and eventually they hand in those tokens to earn some type of reward. So we know that that might not be adequate, that we might need to be reinforcing those expected behaviors more often and perhaps more immediately, right? So those are the kind of things we need to be thinking about. And as I mentioned before, thinking creatively about how we can connect individualized systems to that school-wide acknowledgement system, right? So that eventually we can fade out those individualized systems so that students are relying on the school-wide acknowledgement systems. This other piece is really important as well. We want to make sure that our acknowledgement events are inclusive and accessible. So if there's any sort of party or field trip that students earn as a result of engaging in expected behavior, we have to make sure they're inclusive. We have to make sure that our students with extensive support needs can participate in those. And sometimes that's overlooked, unfortunately. Here's just an example of how you can pair a individualized system with the school-wide acknowledgement system. So maybe the student finds working on the computer highly reinforcing, and so we could eventually incorporate those tiger paw tokens that we talked about earlier into the system so that the student earns those tiger paws. And if they earn a certain number of tiger paws, they can then engage in computer time. So there's ways to be creative in terms of aligning those two systems. And then I've got another cartoon here by Michael Giangreco. It says, Mrs. Jones explains her secret to never getting bent out of shape. And she said, how do you teach kids with such a wide range of needs? And they said flexibility. So, you know, we have to be flexible. We have to think about each and every student and their unique support needs and tailoring the supports at tier 1 to make it accessible and meaningful, right? So I only have a few minutes left with you. I just wanted to share a few additional resources. This is a universal design for learning worksheet that I have used in the past, where you can take your team through the different universal design for learning principles as you're thinking about how to support students at tier 1. So it prompts you to think about, what is the school doing now, right? What are we doing to teach students the expectations and to acknowledge when they do engage in those behaviors? And then taking it a step further and thinking about, well, what can we do to make sure that that information is presented in different ways to meet students' unique needs? What can we do to make sure students can demonstrate their understanding in different ways that make sense for them? And how can we ensure that all students are engaged and motivated during instruction? So that's just a worksheet that we've used that's been helpful. So we don't have time to work on that, but know that URL, that tiny URL, will take you there. And again, all of these are available in that resources document that I shared early on. So just quickly, as we wrap up, a few other considerations. One, everyone needs to be involved in training and professional development. If we're going to support students with extensive support needs in this way, we have to make sure everyone has training in PBIS, and that includes BCBAs, that includes other related services providers, and it also includes paraeducators who are supporting students. So we need to make sure folks have training in the area of PBIS. Likewise, we need to make sure that everyone has a good understanding of how to support students with extensive support needs. So I think the PBIS team at a school needs to have somebody on that team who has expertise in that area, or at least someone who can consult with the team to make sure that students with extensive support needs are being considered. We need to make sure we're collecting data. We don't want to exclude students in data collection. They should be a part of data collection. We need to consider whether or not tier 1 is effective for this population. We also need to make sure they're included in any sort of fidelity assessment, right? Any sort of data that tells us whether or not what we're doing is effective, and thinking about their data as we're making decisions. So quickly, if you could think about like your one big takeaway from tonight, I'm going to pull up a poll everywhere. And I know that's a lot of information crammed into an hour and a half. But what's your one big takeaway from today in thinking about equitable and inclusive PBIS for students with extensive support needs? Oh, very cool. So planning, UDL, very good. So as others come in, we'll see if there's any overlap. Great. So I see in the chat, making it accessible for everybody. Yeah, thinking about students' needs for support, accessibility. Ooh, I like assuming, right? Presuming competence, assuming that students benefit from participation. Yeah, and I see UDL in the chat. Absolutely. Student-centered. Oh, I'm loving it. Yes. Very good. Thank you for participating in that. I think it's always a nice way to wrap up a session. So we're out of time. I know you all have some housekeeping to do related to your CEUs. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. But if you have any questions or comments or would like some support in this area, please don't hesitate to reach out. I would love to chat with you further about this. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Virginia.
Yes, I want to give a little round of applause to Dr. Walker for doing that. And it looks like maybe no tornado warning during the middle. So although she's blacked out the screen at the moment, so we hope she's okay. Good. So yes, thank you everybody for being here. And if we could all turn our screens on in the next couple of minutes, just so I can check everybody's here. I appreciate it. Thank you. And I have it in the chat. Sorry, let me actually push send. This is your feedback form to obtain your CEUs. And there's a QR code there, and I'm going to stop the recording.